The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which Terry Marsh would later decide was appropriate, because nothing important ever announces itself on a Monday when you're still braced for it, or a Friday when you've already let your guard down. Tuesday is the day the world slips something past you while you're focused on getting through the week. He read it standing at the kitchen counter, still in his work jacket, grease from the morning shift faint on his left cuff. The letterhead was unmistakable. The language was formal but not cold. Midlands Forge had been selected. That was the word they used, selected, as if from a great pool of contenders, as if 34 years of keeping a factory floor running with shrinking budgets and expanding targets was a credential worth recognizing to participate in a Royal Roundtable discussion on the future of British manufacturing in an age of automation. Prince William would chair it personally. Terry set the letter down on the counter. He picked up his tea, he read it again. Then he did what any man with 34 years of floor experience does when someone from very far above the production line tells him they care deeply about his industry. He waited to feel something, found mostly a familiar heaviness behind the sternum, and went to make dinner. His wife, Pauline, read it after. She was more impressed than he was, which surprised neither of them. "You should go," she said. "I'm going," he said. "Doesn't mean I think it'll change anything." "Terry, I'm going, Pauline." He went. The briefing pack arrived 10 days later, and this is where Terry's carefully maintained cynicism first encountered something it wasn't entirely prepared for. He had expected the standard material. He had attended enough council consultations, enough union briefings, enough industry forums over the decades to know the genre intimately. There would be graphs showing productivity trends. There would be language about transition and opportunity. There would be a section, always a section, about retraining programs, worded with such relentless optimism that reading it felt like being told a very cheerful lie by someone who meant well but had never stood on a factory floor at 6 in the morning. Watching men who had done one job for 20 years try to imagine doing a different one. The pack was not that. It was dense in a way that bureaucratic documents rarely permit themselves to be. Shift patterns, not industry-wide shift patterns, specific ones, regional unemployment projections broken down not by county but by postcode. Retraining cost analyses that accounted not just for course fees but for the income gap during transition, the childcare implications, the transport costs for workers in areas where the nearest retraining center was 40 minutes away, and the bus ran twice a day. Someone had done the actual maths. Terry sat at the kitchen table with it for 2 hours. He went back to the beginning and read it again. There was a section on intergenerational skill transfer, the specific, unquantifiable knowledge that passes between an experienced worker and an apprentice, not through any formal training document, but through proximity, repetition, and the 10,000 small corrections that happen on a live floor and never get written down anywhere. The section did not use the phrase intergenerational skill transfer. It called it what the workers called it. Knowing the job, he turned to the last page. There was no author listed. He closed the pack and looked at it for a moment. He said to nobody. He put it in his bag for the morning and did not quite sleep as well as usual. The Civic Hall in Birmingham was larger than Terry had expected and quieter than the occasion seemed to warrant. He arrived 40 minutes early because he always arrived 40 minutes early, a habit born from floor management where the 40 minutes before a shift begins is often the 40 minutes that determines how the entire shift goes. He was not the first there. A woman named Diane Okafor, shop steward from a textiles manufacturer in Wolverhampton, was already seated and reading the same briefing pack with the same expression Terry suspected he'd worn at his kitchen table. They nodded at each other with the particular recognition of people who have attended enough of these things to know which other attendees are there because they actually work somewhere. There were others filing in, union representatives. A regional economic development officer whose lanyard identified him with the aggressive cheerfulness of someone who had never been uncertain about his own relevance. 2 men in very good suits, whose name placards Terry didn't recognize, but whose posture he did, the specific upright ease of people who are used to rooms adjusting to them, rather than the reverse. One of the men in good suits was Conrad Ellison. Terry knew the name. Most people in manufacturing knew the name. The way you know the name of a weather system that has been making landfall on industries adjacent to yours for several years. Ellison ran a technology consultancy that advised corporations on automation implementation. He had written a book, he had given a TED Talk. He spoke about the future of labor with the confident fluency of a man who had never had to negotiate a redundancy package with a 53-year-old who had worked the same press since Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister. Ellison was talking to his colleague in a low voice and smiling at something on his phone. Terry got a coffee from the table at the side of the room and took his seat. William arrived without the entrance Terry had unconsciously prepared for. There was no processional quality to it. He came through a side door with two aides, shook hands with the Civic Hall coordinator, paused briefly to say something that made her laugh, genuinely laugh, not perform a laugh, and then moved to his chair at the head of the table with the straightforward economy of someone who had somewhere to be and intended to be useful while he was there. He looked, Terry thought, tired in the specific way that people who are working hard look tired. Not performatively exhausted, just a man who had been putting in hours. They were introduced around the table. When it reached Terry, he said his name and his role and 34 years at Midlands Forge. William nodded. "I've heard good things about the Forge," he said. Terry had no idea what to do with that, so he said thank you, which seemed sufficient. Ellison's presentation began 20 minutes into the session, and it was, Terry had to admit, technically accomplished. The slides were clean, the data was real. The argument had an internal logic that was genuinely difficult to dismiss if you accepted its foundational premise, which was that the displacement of manufacturing workers by automation was not a policy question, but a physics question. It was going to happen. The only variable was the speed. And the only responsible conversation was about managing the transition rather than resisting the inevitable. He used the word inevitable 4 times in the first 10 minutes. He had a chart showing cost per unit comparisons between human labor and automated systems across 17 manufacturing sectors. He had projections showing that factories which resisted automation would simply become uncompetitive and close, resulting in worse outcomes for workers than managed transitions would produce. He was not cruel about it. He was careful, in fact, to express genuine concern for affected workers, to acknowledge the human cost, to use phrases like dignity in transition and skills-forward futures. Terry had heard versions of this argument many times. It always had this quality, the quality of a conclusion that had been reached before the conversation began, dressed in the language of open inquiry. He glanced at William. William was listening with an expression of complete attention. He had a folder open in front of him. He had not looked at his phone. He had not leaned over to his aide. He was simply listening. With a pen in his hand and the specific stillness of someone who is storing information rather than waiting for their turn to speak, Ellison concluded. He thanked the room. He sat back with the slight ease of a man who had delivered this material many times and expected the usual response, which was a period of somewhat awed silence, followed by questions about implementation timelines. William opened his folder. "Thank you, Conrad," he said. "I want to ask you about something specific." His voice was level, not confrontational. Genuinely curious in a way that Terry would later struggle to describe, because it didn't have the quality of performed curiosity, the kind that politicians deploy when they want to seem engaged. It had the quality of a man who had a question because he needed the answer. "Your cost per unit analysis in the 3rd slide," William said. "The figure for human labor in precision components that's drawn from the 2023 industry survey." "Yes," Ellison confirmed it. "That survey excluded facilities operating under legacy tooling agreements," William said, "which would include most of the older Midlands factories because the tooling contracts predate the survey methodology. If you include those, the cost differential drops by roughly 18% in the short term. Are your projections modeled on the adjusted figure or the survey figure?" A pause, brief but present. "The survey figure," Ellison said. "Right," William said. He made a note. "And the retraining pathway in your transition model, the 40-week digital skills program. Where is that delivered in practice for workers in, say, Walsall or Dudley?" Ellison named a center. That center has a 12-week waiting list and no evening cohorts, Williams said. For a shift worker with a family, the gap between redundancy and retraining entry is 3 months of no income. Your model accounts for the retraining cost, but not the income gap. When you model outcomes, are you counting workers who begin retraining or workers who complete it? The room had gone very quiet. Not the silence of an awkward moment, the silence of people recalibrating. Terry would think about this later, trying to identify the precise moment the room changed. It wasn't a dramatic turn. William didn't raise his voice. He didn't score points. He moved through his folder with the methodical patience of someone who had prepared for this conversation the way you prepare for something that matters, which is to say thoroughly and without shortcuts. He had testimony, not statistics, testimony. He read from notes about a press operator in Telford named Alan, who had gone through a managed transition program and whose retraining placement had dissolved when the company sponsoring it was acquired 18 months later. He had a figure for how many transition placements in the West Midlands over the past 4 years had resulted in permanent employment at equivalent wage. The figure was not in Ellison's presentation. It was not flattering. He had visited. It emerged through the conversation 14 factories across the Midlands and the North in the preceding 8 months. Not on official engagements, not with press. Quietly, he had stood on floors, he had watched processes, he had talked to workers on their breaks and to supervisors between shifts and to plant managers after hours when the formal part of the visit was done, and people stopped performing and started talking. Diane Okafor, the shop steward from Wolverhampton, said something at this point that Terry had been thinking but hadn't put into words. "You went to Pemberton's in Walsall?" she said. It wasn't quite a question. William said he had. "My cousin works there," she said. She mentioned a visit. She said she didn't know who it was at the time. I asked them not to make a thing of it. William said simply. I needed them to talk to me normally. There was a beat of something in the room that Terry, who had spent 34 years learning to read the atmosphere of a floor, would have called a shift in weight. The kind that happens when people stop performing their roles and start being present in a room together. Ellison was quiet. He was not broken. He was not humiliated, but his certainty had developed a texture it hadn't had 40 minutes earlier. He was listening now in the way that William had been listening to him, storing, reassessing, working through something. The conversation continued for another 90 minutes. It did not resolve into a declaration or a verdict. Real conversations rarely do. But the shape of the thing changed. The framing changed. The question was no longer whether the transition was inevitable, but whether the institutions responsible for managing it had been honest about its actual costs, its actual timelines, its actual outcomes for actual people. William closed his folder at the end. He thanked the room with the directness of someone who meant it. He shook hands. He left through the same side door he had entered. Terry sat for a moment after, his coffee long cold in front of him, looking at the empty chair at the head of the table. Diane caught his eye across the table. 8 months, she said quietly. Yeah, Terry said. He drove home on the M6 in the early evening traffic, the Birmingham skyline behind him going amber in the low sun, and thought about the briefing pack on his kitchen table and the section about knowing the job and the name that hadn't been listed on the last page. The weeks after the round table had a quality that Terry found difficult to describe to people who hadn't been in the room. Nothing happened dramatically. There were no headlines, no ministerial announcements, no press releases with William's name attached to anything that would connect directly to that Tuesday in Birmingham. But things moved. Terry heard it first from a union contact in Sheffield. A manufacturing task force had been quietly convened. Its terms of reference unusually specific about income gap provisions in transition programs. Then from a colleague in Coventry whose plant had received a funding inquiry from a regional development body. The inquiry citing metrics Terry recognized from the briefing pack. He heard from a supervisor at a plastics factory in Stoke, who had also been visited months before the round table, who said the visit had lasted 3 hours and William had spent most of it on the floor rather than in the office. She said he'd asked about the oldest machine in the building and then asked about the person who knew it best and then spent 45 minutes talking to that person. He took notes, she said, as if this was the strangest part. Terry thought about that. about the specific discipline required to spend 8 months gathering information you intend to use in a single meeting, knowing that the meeting will be framed as ceremonial, knowing that the man across the table will arrive with a polished presentation and the confidence of someone who expects the room to arrange itself around his conclusions. He thought about the decision not to bring press, the clean logic of it. If the cameras come, the workers perform. If the workers perform, you get the version they think you want, which is never quite the version that's true. If you want the truth, you arrive without announcement and you ask about the oldest machine and you take notes and you leave and you come back to Birmingham 8 months later with a folder. A senior aide, Terry heard this through Diane, who heard it through a contact at the Civic Hall, had confirmed off the record that the preparation had begun the previous autumn, that the targeting of Ellison's specific arguments had been deliberate, that William had read the book, had watched the TED Talk, had identified the precise data sources and their methodological gaps before the invitations had even been sent. This was not a round table, it was a verdict delivered in the form of a conversation, which is the only kind of verdict that actually changes anything, because a verdict delivered as a verdict only hardens the positions it intends to correct. Terry thought about the cost of that approach, the specific cost of 8 months of quiet. He had been in rooms with powerful people who wanted credit for caring. He had watched politicians tour factories for the cameras with hard hats on that had never touched a real construction site and ask questions they already knew the answers to because the answers had been briefed to them in the car on the way over. He had learned to perform the reciprocal role, the grateful worker, the reassured constituent, because that was the transaction and both sides understood it and nobody benefited from breaking the fiction. William had refused the transaction, not dramatically, not with any visible declaration of intent. Simply by arriving without the cameras, before anyone knew he was supposed to care, which meant the workers had no role to perform and could only be themselves, which was all he needed. The cost of that was invisibility. 8 months of visits that would never be attached to his name in any official record. 8 months of genuine engagement that the public would never fully see, replaced in the public narrative by a 90-minute roundtable that looked from the outside, like every other royal engagement that had ever been quietly appreciated and promptly forgotten. Terry understood, sitting with this, that the invisibility was the point, not as sacrifice as method. You cannot hear the truth of a place if the place knows it's being watched. You cannot understand what is actually happening on a floor if the floor is performing for you. The silence before the meeting was not modesty, it was instrument. He found this in some way he couldn't fully articulate to Pauline when he tried to explain it that evening, genuinely moving. Not in a sentimental way. In the way that competence, real competence, the kind that looks effortless because the effort happened somewhere nobody saw, is moving when you've spent enough years watching people simulate it. Terry went back to work the following Monday. The floor was exactly as he had left it. The press in Bay 3 that had been misaligning since September was still misaligning and still waiting for the part that had been on order for 6 weeks. The morning shift came in with their usual mix of energy and exhaustion and the specific resigned humor of people who have made their peace with the gap between the conditions they deserve and the conditions they have. Nothing had changed. And yet, he walked the floor that morning with a different quality of attention. He noticed the things he always noticed. The slight vibration in the secondary conveyor that would become a problem in 3 weeks if the belt tension wasn't adjusted. The way the new intake worker in Bay 7 was still favoring his right hand because he hadn't yet learned to trust the grip on the left side control. But he also noticed with a clarity that surprised him the particular texture of knowledge that lived in this building, 34 years of it in him alone. Decades more distributed across the floor in people who knew things that were not written anywhere, that had passed from hand to hand and shift to shift and would not survive the removal of the hands that held them. The section in the briefing pack, knowing the job. He thought about William arriving at a factory in Stoke and asking about the oldest machine, and then asking about the person who knew it best. Asking the right question. The question that revealed what the cost per unit analysis in Ellison's clean slides could not capture, which was that the knowledge embedded in a factory floor was not interchangeable with automated precision and was not fully transferable through a 40-week digital skills program, and that losing it was not a transition cost. It was a permanent subtraction from something that could not be rebuilt once it was gone. Someone had understood this before the meeting, had understood it specifically enough to go find the evidence, and had gone to find it in the only place it actually existed, which was not in an industry survey or a think tank report or a well-sourced presentation by a man with a TED Talk, but on the floors themselves, in the conversations with the people who showed up every morning and knew the job. The machines were still there. The people were still there, for now. But someone with the actual authority to affect the outcome had arrived 8 months early and done the actual work. And that was not nothing. That was in fact the thing that separated the real interventions from the performed ones. Not the room you sit in, not the title on the door, not the quality of your slides. The work you do before anyone knows you're supposed to do it. Terry finished his floor walk and went to his office and sat down and looked at the window that faced the main floor. The press in Bay 3 was running. The new intake worker in Bay 7 was getting his grip right. The morning was underway. He thought about the letter arriving on a Tuesday, about the briefing pack with no author on the last page, about a folder opening quietly at a table in Birmingham, and a question being asked about a survey methodology gap that Ellison had not expected anyone in that room to know. He thought about the word selected. He had read it initially with the mild condescension reserved for language that meant less than it claimed. Now he turned it over and found it meant exactly what it said. Not selected for ceremony. Not selected to provide the optics of working-class inclusion in a conversation already decided. Selected because someone had spent 8 months learning which factories had the most to lose and the clearest evidence, and the workers most able to articulate what was actually at stake, and had made a list, and Midlands Forge had been on it. That was different. Not enough, perhaps. Not on its own, not against the full weight of the economic forces that Ellison's slides described with their cold arithmetic. But different in the specific way that preparation is different from performance. Different in the way that showing up before the cameras in the ordinary mornings of places nobody important is supposed to care about is different from showing up for the event. The crown, Terry had said to Pauline, was never just decoration. She had looked at him with the expression she reserved for moments when he said something that surprised her, which happened less often at 58 than it had at 30. And she had said, "That's a big statement from a man who spent the whole drive home saying he didn't expect anything. He had not had a good answer for that." He still didn't, but he thought the statement held. Outside the office window, the floor ran, the shift turned, the knowledge moved, hand to hand, the way it always had, the way it would continue to as long as there were hands to receive it. For now, that was enough. For now, the people were still there. And it had started, Terry thought, on a Tuesday he hadn't been ready for, with a letter that used the word selected and a briefing pack that nobody expected to be real, sitting on a kitchen counter under a work jacket with grease on the left cuff. As it turned out, the right people had been paying attention. They just hadn't told anyone yet.